Welcome back to Sun Storytelling. We're now in the final part of this mini-series. Before we dive into the characters that exemplify these concepts, I want to clarify the last two steps. We briefly touched on step 2 earlier, but it deserves a deeper exploration. Let's pick up where we left off and delve into the second half of Rule 2 before moving on to Rule 3. As we proceed, I'll continue providing examples of both strengths and weaknesses to illustrate my points clearly. This will help you understand the concepts I'm discussing and how they apply to character development. Now let's move on to the last aspect of Rule 2, that being that all main cast members we see present in the story undergo some form of mental or physical training arc. Like previously stated, the current benchmarks progression story usually isn't presented before the upcoming benchmarks, reason being they're not the central point of the story. Yujiro from Baki and Gojo from Jujutsu Kaisen are good examples of not seeing their backstory until later on in the series, as to focus on the upcoming characters. Remember that all Step 1 serves as is the trigger that initiates the training required to progress in Rule 2. I know this can be a bit convoluted, so let me simplify. The training arcs serve one big purpose. They demonstrate the culmination of experience a character has accumulated throughout the story. For obvious reasons, these arcs usually don't occur in the first 1 or 2 arcs of a series. For example, the tuning exams in Naruto take place in the 3rd arc, while Yu Yu Hakusho's Dark Tournament arc occurs in the middle of the series. Both arcs have their benefits at different points in the story, reflecting the character's progression. Typically, all lower level characters are involved, which can include the entire cast in some cases. For instance, while the teachers are not involved in the tuning exams, Yusuke's teacher participated in his tournament/training arc during his early progression. So there can be different instances on how this can be executed as long as these core steps are followed and presented to the audience in Rule 2. Think of these training segments in Rule 2 as gatekeeping parts. Rule 1 pulls the trigger to meet the gatekeeper in Rule 2. Characters cannot progress without overcoming this hurdle. This doesn't always have to take the form of a tournament setting. For example, the tuning exams in Naruto were a dual blend of a survival gauntlet followed by a tournament. A more recent example was the Calling Game arc from Jujutsu Kaisen. While many of these stories feature smaller scenarios throughout different arcs that characters must overcome, there is usually a clear distinguishable arc that sets itself apart from the others, usually having either a small, overpowered character to overcome or a bigger one. However, there is one method of portraying training that I recommend all writers avoid unless they are truly seasoned in the craft: the time skip. While many successful pieces of media have used this technique effectively, it often leaves audiences with a sour taste. Overusing time skips can lead to a decline in the narrative quality, as viewers may feel disconnected from character development and progression. A time skip is a narrative device used in storytelling, literature, and film where the timeline jumps forward, omitting a specific period. This technique allows the story to progress without detailing every single moment or event in between, often highlighting significant changes in characters or settings. When utilized correctly, time skips can create suspense, showcase the character development, and advance the plot more effectively. Key word here is being utilized correctly. My personal recommendation is to portray and demonstrate your character's progress. If you successfully achieve this, consider placing your time skip further along in the narrative, ideally where the character needs to age. This approach blends both styles while keeping the story fresh and engaging for your audience. Naruto Shippuden, Dragon Ball, and Dragon Ball Z are excellent examples of series that effectively complete steps 1 and 2 multiple times throughout their narratives. One Piece is notorious for showing Step 2 off-screen. While some narratives benefit from this approach, I would argue that One Piece handles it adequately but definitely not exceptionally, given its unique narrative format. However, the frequent use of this technique is a significant rule breaker in my book. I would love to see Luffy and the Straw Hats training arcs unfold in real time, as it would enhance my appreciation for the results of their efforts. Instead, I'm often left with a stagnant feeling afterward. In my opinion, relying on off-screen training is unwise because it's challenging to execute effectively. The training a character undergoes should always be shown to the audience at least once in the story. So let's adhere to that methodology going forward. Another approach to training can occur in the mental or spiritual realm, as seen in Avatar, The Last Airbender, and Bleach. I appreciate this method for its uniqueness compared to other styles, and when utilized properly, it can greatly enhance the pacing of the entire narrative. This is a key to keeping the audience engaged with the character's actions. Whether they win or lose in Step 2, their experiences contribute to the character growth, shaping their development and adding depth to their overall narrative. Remember, not every character in this step is attempting to surpass or become the next benchmark. They simply need to level up or risk being left behind in the power scale. Remember, as stated before, the current benchmark characters do not necessarily have to participate in these training arcs or Step 2 unless they have the benchmark being surpassed in that specific narrative arc. Distinction is crucial because surpassing the benchmark is what I refer to as Rule 3 or the payoff. As the series progresses, the benchmark will change constantly. This is typical in almost every battle shonen, ensuring that characters always face new challenges. While some overpowered characters can be overcome for that payoff, a true payoff occurs when the benchmark is finally defeated. Once Step 1 and 2 are displayed to the audience, Step 3 should follow soon after. This is why I needed to explain the intricacies of Rule 2, as the last step requires no further explanation. So we have the trigger, Step 1, the training, Step 2, and the payoff, Step 3. I hope all the steps are now clear as they come together. I will now provide examples of different series that effectively and don't effectively display this payoff or execution of Rule 3. We will begin with examples we previously discussed, like in Gojo's case from Jujutsu Kaisen. He fights another current benchmark to complete his Step 3, which involves sacrificing himself to help prepare Yuta, Yuji, and Maki, the upcoming benchmarks, to overcome Sukuna, the current benchmark. For additional context, Gojo's Step 2 is demonstrated when he fights and defeats Toji, which prepares him for this pivotal moment. We can see a similar structure in Yusuke's Dark Tournament arc, where Genkai, a benchmark herself and Yusuke's teacher, is forced to fight Toguro, the reigning benchmark, and is ultimately defeated. This completes her Step 3, providing the payoff for both Toguro and Genkai's stories. Throughout the tournament, we witnessed their paths bit by bit, and they both completed Step 2 by finishing the Dark Tournament years ago in their own respective arcs, solidifying their roles as the current benchmarks. We only come in to witness Step 3, the payoff for this conclusion, in the current point in the narrative. This was the final push for Yusuke to overcome the benchmark Toguro, thus completing his and his team's Step 2 and 3 by defeating the other competitors and ultimately conquering Team Toguro. I hope Step 3 is starting to make more sense, as Step 2 and 3 should occur back to back, as we see both in the Dark Tournament and in the Calling Games. While Jujutsu Kaisen concludes after the Calling Games, Yu Yu Hakusho continues after the Dark Tournament arc, meaning that Steps 1, 2, and 3 can happen multiple times throughout the overall narrative, which will never stagnate the plot or the pace, which is crucial to keeping the audience engaged. The key here is that the benchmark presented in that arc is defeated within the same arc, rather than extending beyond it, which I believe is a significant issue in many series. The problem with having multiple payoffs is that it diminishes the impact of overcoming the benchmark if they're not defeated in the respective arc. This often drags the narrative longer than necessary. Togashi understood this, which is why there are no time skips until the very end in Yu Yu Hakusho, because it simply isn't needed, because each benchmark is defeated in the arc they are introduced. Too many small payoffs are prevalent in Baki, where he overcomes his brother in the underground tournament to determine who will face their father. The major issue is that he does not confront his father until many arcs later, leaving the audience wondering when the final showdown will finally occur. Baki fulfills Rule 2 and 3 by defeating his brother. Even if you don't consider Jack a true benchmark, which he isn't, he is still an overpowered character for the end of that arc. However, this leads to frustration and confusion, as the audience is left wondering how many times this loop of Step 2 and 3 will repeat. You may notice that one of the steps is missing from this sequence, and that is why it feels off. The same motivation or trigger is used throughout the entire series, and this can tire the audience. And to truly complete Step 3, a benchmark needs to be overcome for a true payoff. That true payoff is Yujiro, who is simply being saved for a later point in the narrative, effectively blue-balling the audience and making them wait. The problem with this is that a prolonged anticipation for the final confrontation, and that can ruin a lot of the pacing. By the time it occurs, the audience may not care about the outcome, having already seen multiple payoffs throughout the story, as is the case in Baki. One way to improve this would have been to avoid mentioning Yujiro or showing him present in the story at all, except in flashbacks or maybe in cutscenes, and allowing Jack to serve as the benchmark that needed to be overcome in initial arcs, or as that goalpost. Once that conflict is resolved, Yujiro can then enter the narrative as the new benchmark, having been built up through anticipation, rumors, cutscenes, foreshadowing, etc. This highlights why having the same benchmark can create narrative confusion for step 3. To achieve a true payoff, a clear benchmark needs to be overcome or met or something along those lines. My personal recommendation is to have 2 or 3 benchmarks singled throughout the narrative that need to be overcome, allowing for a gradual character progression. Steps 2 and 3 should follow each other back to back to set up the next major antagonist for the upcoming arc. This usually means looping back into step 2 again, which works well if step 3 was truly completed, signifying that the previous benchmark has been overcome and a new trigger or step 1 can begin, similar to what we see in the Dark Tournament after it is completed in Yu Yu Hakusho. The audience should only be aware of the current benchmark that needs to be overcome in that particular arc to ensure clarity and prevent confusion. Having characters strive for the same benchmark arc after arc after arc without any payoff creates stagnation in the story. While this approach may work at times in Baki's narrative, I would not recommend it as a strategy for any other writer. Togashi is an expert in crafting these kinds of narratives, as demonstrated in both Yu Yu Hakusho and Hunter x Hunter, both of which are fighting series. Hisoka is the first true benchmark presented in the story, and we get glimpses of his abilities in the initial arcs. There is even a small confrontation between Gon and Hisoka, which clearly shows the audience that a significant amount of time will need to pass before Gon is ready to face him again in a true battle. We understand that our characters are nowhere near Hisoka's level, so having smaller, overpowered characters for them to overcome in the arcs leading up to that climactic battle works well and makes narrative sense. We also see steps 1, 2, and 3 consistently on display, even if they don't always lead to true payoffs. Their narrative guides us toward the ultimate goal, ensuring we understand what we are building toward without being thrown off course. The key is the continuous motion of all 3 steps in unison. They must be actively happening. When these steps are in constant motion, we see this formula work at its best, and in my opinion, Hunter x Hunter exemplifies this brilliantly. For clarity, the benchmark in this narrative would be Jing. Some may wonder why he doesn't confront Gon correctly, but the point is that Jing serves as the goalpost later on in the story. Again, there could be multiple benchmarks, and this highlights how this can be utilized in the narrative. The objective is just to meet him, and while he is only hinted at and not fully presented until later in the story, he represents the true benchmark that Gon is striving to reach. By keeping Jing somewhat removed from the narrative, we can focus on the other characters. We catch only fleeting glimpses of him, which is a tactic I think Baki could have employed when trying to create the narrative surrounding Yujiro. As a huge fan of these series, I enjoy delving deep into their narrative structures to see how all the elements fit together. Drawing direct comparisons helps emphasize my points, especially since I know they can sometimes be convoluted. With all that in mind, I've decided to save the remainder of the series to truly dive into characterization and focus entirely on the characters within the story, rather than explaining the different parts of the formula that make the narrative possible. I want to continue exploring the benchmark power scale, but now I aim to delve deeper into characterization, something I feel didn't fully address with many of the characters I previously mentioned. Dragon Ball Z and Jujutsu Kaisen are just a couple of the series I wish to examine more closely. Many characters in these works of art deserve more dedication and time, and I believe this is the best way to move forward with the series. In conclusion, understanding how to effectively craft overpowered characters in a fighting series and manage power scaling is essential for creating a compelling narrative. By following these 3-step criteria outlined in these videos, you can navigate the complexities of character development and ensure that your story remains engaging and in balance. It was important to delve into these processes step by step, as media in this genre often navigates a gray area while interpreting and applying these critiques in different criteria in many unique ways. Providing examples help clarify my perspective and establishes a common ground for understanding the character analysis and conclusions drawn in this discussion. This approach aims to illuminate the diverse interpretations of power scaling and character development and storytelling. As you continue to explore different forms of media and development in your writing, remember the importance of these principles. Analyze how other characters can handle power scaling and character arcs, and use this knowledge to inform your own work. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon.